Many Brits still see Australia as a dream of beaches, barbecues and beer, but increasingly there is a boomerang in the works. The cost of living in Australia is higher than it was before, and jobs are far more insecure. But there are other factors that can disturb one's dreams. A recent article in the Daily Mail showed that one couple who'd come from the UK had returned partly in shock of the lack of Robinson's fruit juice. Dreams are clearly sometimes fragile things. It's a fragility well understood for those from refugee and asylum-seeking backgrounds expecting a better life in Australia, only to have their rights cruelly denied in incarceration on the islands of Manus and Nauru. Their plight can remind us of the other rights that are denied freely to young people in Australia, the UK and other countries. Look at Articles 28 and 29 of the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, and its promise of access to the highest quality education for young people up to the age of 16 is an experience not always provided for those growing up in a life of the care system. A new proposal by the Australian government to move people from the islands of Manus and Nauru to the United States of America feels like a suggestion to jump from the frying pan and into the fire. Living the dream feels an experience that is increasingly compromised. Once we could hope to settle down and pay off the mortgage, but then it was more a case of trying to find a mortgage to settle down. Now it's more about being able to afford something in the private rented sector, or for some young people, even having a dream at all. With our rights under threat, I was relieved to hear from a judge in Victoria that since the F word had become part of everyday Australian vernacular, along with the phrases Vegemite, batting collapse and political leadership coup, it was perfectly acceptable for us to face up to those threatening our rights and dreams and tell them to fuck off. I expect there's a long list of people we could make a note of to exchange that pleasantry with. More offensive than the F word is the language we use to describe young people dismissively as bludgers and neats. It's hard to imagine in a world where we are trying to develop more sophisticated technology and require ever more sophisticated skills that a government in New South Wales is investing $65 million in sticking young people into boot camps and teaching them how to speak politely. If that is our best conception of talking about young people and preparing them for the world of work, it's no wonder that those in the criminal justice system sometimes end up with hoods over their faces, shackled to chairs. The American film The House I Live In offers us a stark warning to the prejudicial factors of society. We can identify groups such as young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. We ostracize them under stereotypical language of layabouts and bludgers. We confiscate their welfare and rights. We concentrate them in the criminal justice system and boot camps, and then we annihilate them. Perhaps that is easier for governments to focus on than the three things that will bring about the greatest solutions to the problems of youth disadvantage and homelessness. If we want young people to live the dream, then we desperately need to ensure they have access to the right types of housing to support their transition into adulthood. We also need to confront the fact that youth unemployment is often significantly higher around the world than general unemployment, and has been for some time. These are not layabout bludgers. These are young people who are trying to navigate through a changing economic system that we do not have the resilience and grit to change. Finally, young people are often entering the homeless system because they are dealing with the conflicts and challenges in their homes and in their mental health. It is our unwillingness or incapacity to focus on these areas and generate real solutions that diminish people's chances of having a dream to live. As the great Irish poet William Butler Yeats and the American poet Delmore Schwartz both wrote, "In dreams begin responsibilities." We have a responsibility to help ensure that all young people stand a chance of living a dream. If we're to do that justice, to do justice to our responsibility, to do justice to the dream for young people, then we must challenge the barriers and obstacles that prevent those dreams from becoming real. That's why in my work at UK charity Foyers Federation, we sought to do it justice by matching our aspiration and belief in people with programs that invested in their capacity to thrive. It meant new initiatives such as open talent and advantage thinking that were prepared to recognize young people for their talents and to use the best approaches possible to develop them. It meant new programs in health and employability. Instead of sticking young people into boot camps, we invested in young people so they could address their own health inequalities and develop projects that could do good in their local communities and gain work readiness skills through them. All this fits what Foyers Federation today would refer to as a trust youth campaign. Why don't we trust young people for what they can do, for what they could do, for who they are, not as bludgers and layabouts? This type of asset-based positive investment approach or advantage thinking should never be simply misunderstood as strengths-based practice. Strengths-based practice, along with other types of practice, certainly are important components of an asset-based approach, but do not on their own terms fully challenge the status quo. If we're to invest in young people and to do it justice, purely focusing on strengths-based practice would be like eating a salad in McDonald's and pretending we're living a healthy lifestyle. We must also be systemic. We must look at the full system, and that requires a more sophisticated form of asset-based approach. Anyone reducing that wider frame to simply strengths-based practice or misunderstanding the two is simply not doing it justice. Here's an example of how we can address that more effectively. If we turn to a combination of Aristotle's The Good Life and the Sustainable Livelihoods approach, we can develop a more sophisticated form of narrative. Living the dream is easily reframed as Aristotle's question, how do we live the good life, for each of us now and in our future? Taking that question to work with young people, we can easily see how the good life for them in a particular stage might be in their capacity to survive and cope with disadvantage. But it also requires those services that can enable young people to begin to adapt to a more positive transition and move towards a position where they have the assets and experiences to thrive. Either those services must be pulled together in a continuum between those which enable young people to survive and cope and those that enable young people to adapt and thrive, or services themselves must somehow manage to do all of them. This is a holistic approach. If we're to do it justice for young people, therefore, we must ensure that their ability to live the dream, to have a good life, is matched by sufficient services and approaches that will enable them to progress through surviving and coping into positions where they can adapt and thrive. If that continuum is not present, if those services are not joined up into a holistic whole, then whilst we can offer young people investments towards a better life, investments towards living a dream, they can never fully do it justice. Like others around the world, the Australian government is increasingly concerned by the numbers of people who are being left to survive and cope with disadvantaged services and welfare, rather than using such services and welfare as a safety net and springboard back into a thriving life. But the government response is to miss the point. It puts the obligation and responsibilities on the failures of the individuals involved, rather than realise that there is a fairer, more mutual deal to be shared between person, government, and support service that goes beyond sticking people in boot camps and labelling them as homeless towards realising the important social and personal investments required to create a society where everyone has a chance to adapt and thrive. Rather than police the punitive obligations of welfare, governments would do well to learn from the more positive conditionality enshrined in the something for something Foyer deal. In this context, just to do it is just to fail. If we're happy to just doing the same old policies and programs that can only help people to survive and cope, then we're accepting the fact that we're just delivering the same old shit that in the end doesn't really work. The phrase "just do it" is famously used by Nike to sell millions of dollars of products. Nike was inspired by the last words of a vulnerable young man in America who said in front of a firing squad, "Let's do it." The more our sector continues to just do it by putting young people into policies and programs where they can only survive and cope, then the more we put those young people and ourselves in front of a firing squad with no real sustainable future to what we do. In other words, we can only truly do it justice for young people and the charity sector when we can do more than just help young people to cope with systems that aren't working. Since October, I've been travelling around Australia to see how the Foyer network is doing it justice for young people. In Victoria, I found how the Education First Foyers invested in young people and students. In Illawarra, I discovered Southern Youth and Family Services had converted an old police station into a community hub with a foyer. In Perth, the 98-bed project provided an effective way of engaging large groups of young people. In Logan, Wesley Mission had located the foyer directly in a highly disadvantaged community. And in Adelaide, Ladder and St John's Youth Services had joined together to provide an integrated service that fitted within a continuum of other St John's provision. So what do I, Colin Faulkner, have to offer? Since leaving the Foyer Federation in 2015, I've been researching and developing a new approach that aims to look at the areas in which asset-based and advantage thinking ought to innovate further in order to take its philosophies to the next level of action. This means looking at how organizations and systems can grow in asset-based ways, how we can optimize the focus of innovation in asset-based theory, how we can open up new forms of collaboration and partnership, and how we can determine our understanding of the solutions that can actually end disadvantage. Within my model, it is inspiration which is the missing secret factor that can help us achieve this, and thus I'm still looking for an organization who I can inspire or who would be inspirational enough to work with me to develop this new InspireSide approach to assets and advantage thinking. Left to my own devices, I've been seeking to innovate new tools that will populate my model with opportunities for organizations to work with. The first of these is consultancy to explore whether organizational values really do it justice for young people in practice. In particular, through the often antiquated HR policies and management structures through which organizations sometimes operate. Next up are two practical innovation approaches that can help organizations optimize their vision and practice. The first of these is called Connected to Change. It blends theory of change with sustainable livelihoods approach and research from America all of which is blended together to look at how young people can be mapped to and connected with the physical and practical and personal change determinants that exist in their communities and beyond to help them make a successful transition into adulthood. Connected to change approach will also give organisations an easy way to track and demonstrate impact and outcomes, something which on my travels around Australia is badly needed. The idea of Talent Lodge is inspired by functional business hotels which enable people to travel from city to city whilst using safe but basic accommodation. In my travels, I've often noticed that young people are effectively denied access into employment because their accommodation doesn't support it. In other words, the rental levels are such that it would disincentivize or prevent a young person from accepting a job. That needs to change, and it is possible to change too, by looking at ways in which different providers can at least create some accommodation units which are geared up to focus on providing a space that supports young people to express their talent for apprenticeships, internships, and employment, having cheaper rents in return for a different level of service, and a something for something deal in terms of the roles that these young people can provide back through peer-to-peer support. Every good foyer should have at least one room that can be a talent lodge. My third area of innovation, I'm looking for tools and campaigns that can bring organisations to account to do it justice better by actually collaborating instead of competing. Competition in this sector often goes against the values by which organisations live, and yet they are pressurised to do so. We've got to fight back and find better ways to collaborate, but also better ways to give more power and equality to the young people we should be working with as well as serving. Having worked outside an organisation over the last year, I've witnessed the range of talents in smaller community-based organisations and in consultants that are simply not being harnessed to effect. It is also true that youth involvement in this sector is often way beneath the capacity it should be to bring about meaningful change. My last area is how we determine understanding through the way we actually go about collecting and utilising data. This is still a sector which struggles to invest in merely using data to demonstrate what it does. What this sector needs to do is to begin to learn from some of the approaches of predictive analytics and begin to think about how it can use data to actually shape the services it provides. Until we do that, we are simply not doing it justice by collecting output data for funders and commissioners, but never going the extra mile to explore the data by which we can actually understand what's working for ourselves. So InspireChilli is very much not just a model and framework, it's also a campaign. The campaign to do it justice by using inspiration and focusing on innovation to create and shape the good life with young people. But who am I to say all this now that I'm just one person with little power to influence and few opportunities to speak out? The one thing I do have, though, is knowledge and understanding and experience, and above all, the passion to keep thinking out beyond the status quo. So please, whatever you do, at least do it justice with what you've got to give.